Okay, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what's going on in federal funding, and then also talk a little bit about what it means if you've received federal funding for the first time. So a lot to get through in about 30 minutes here. So as far as what's going on in federal funding right now, for the municipalities on the call, the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA funding, is really the hot topic right now. And this came out of the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. There's about $350 billion available to states, tribal entities, local governments, U.S. territories, et cetera. At this point, this is still in an interim state. It's essentially being called the interim final rule, but everything's pretty solidified at this point. It's just still kind of in that interim state. We are expecting all of the ARPA funds to be subject to single audit requirements. For recipients, you could be either a direct recipient or an indirect recipient of the funds, meaning you might have gotten the funding directly from the federal government, or it may have come indirectly through the state, or most likely a state or possibly a county. And this is really just going to be dependent on your size. There are really 5 buckets available to use the ARPA funds. The first one is to support the public health response. Second, address negative economic impacts. Provide government services to the extent of a reduction in revenue, and we're going to talk about this on an upcoming slide. Provide premium pay to essential workers, and then make necessary investments in water, sewer, stormwater, or broadband infrastructure. The time period for these funds, they must be obligated by December 31st, 2024, and then spent by December 31st, 2026. As far as reporting, there are various reporting requirements, and it really is correlated to the size of your entity and whether or not essentially you receive direct or indirect funding. For those that receive direct funding, August 31st of this year is going to be the first date you want to be paying attention to. That's when your interim reporting is going to be due. For everyone else, the next date, October 31st, is going to be the date you want to be paying attention to. And that's when the first project and expenditure reports are going to be due. And every year until the funding is used and your reporting requirements are no longer existent, you would be reporting on October 31st of that year. And there are some entities that will have additional reporting dates. So make sure you pay attention to those depending on the size of your entity. All right, revenue loss calculation. So this has been a big item that we've been talking about here with our clients and doing many presentations on. And that's really because this loss of revenue opens up the available uses to a very broad category. And so the spirit behind this use of the ARPA funding is really related to replacing any revenue that your entity may have lost due to COVID, directly impacted or indirectly impacted. So you have to calculate this based on what they're calling a lack of growth of, I'll say, quote unquote, general revenue that comes straight out of the interim role. And they're defining general revenue based on essentially what the Census Bureau has as their concept of general revenue from your own sources. So they're not saying it's identical to that, but it's based on that. I do have a slide where we'll talk a little bit more about the general revenues, but essentially it's revenues that you as the entity are creating on your own based on whatever services you're providing or your own actions are creating this revenue. So in order to calculate revenue growth, they've essentially told everyone that you can use 4.1% as this revenue growth factor. However, if your entity in the previous 3 full fiscal years prior to COVID-19, so those years would be from 2016 to 17, 2017 to 18, and 2018 to 19. It's really 4 years, but 3 years of revenue growth. If that average for you is greater than 4.1%, you get to use that number. But if your average is less than 4.1%, you can use 4.1%. So essentially the minimum amount you would use as your growth factor would be that 4.1%. There is just the opportunity to potentially be using a higher growth factor. This revenue loss calculation actually can be done at 4 different points of time. So the one we're all calculating right now is December 31st, 2020. You again will be able to calculate this at December 31, 2021, 2022, and 2023. Now, it's really dependent on how you as a recipient plan to use your funds. You might have used them all up by December 31st, 2022 or 2023, but that option is out there for entities to continue doing this revenue loss calculation. And that revenue growth factor would be used year over year. I will point out the GFOA has a great template that can be used to walk through this calculation. It's on their website. It's called the ARPA Revenue Replacement Calculator. And I highly recommend taking a look at that. I know there are some other templates out there. This is just the one that I personally have been using for some of my presentations, examples, and some of the calculations that we've been doing. The next slide here, so I said I'd get back to the general revenue item. There is a great illustration out on ARPA's website in their frequently asked questions document. And this was updated as of June 24th of this year. And the appendix, and that's, you're seeing an image of that. I know it's really small, not intending to actually go through the details here today, but just to give you a visual of what it looks like. This goes down through and you'll see the greens and the reds. Reds mean not to be used in the calculation of general revenue. Green means go, to essentially go ahead and use those. At the end of the day, there's a lot of information in the interim final rule. There's a lot of information in the frequently asked questions. And then there's even this illustration. But there may need to be some kind of judgment calls as far as how you're interpreting the guidance. And we just recommend that you make sure that you're documenting everything when you're essentially, if you're interpreting something to say, we're including this because this said X, Y, Z. So just make sure you're documenting all of that. So if you do find yourself having some lost revenue and you've got that broader bucket to use funds, this is where it really opens the door and you can use those funds for what they're calling government services, which include but are not limited to, maintenance of and building infrastructure, including roads, cybersecurity modernization, health services, environmental remediation, school or educational services, police, fire, other public safety services. What they are very clear on that you cannot use the funds even under the revenue loss category is interest and principal payments on outstanding debt, fees or issuance costs related to new debt, replenishing any rainy day or other reserve funds, paying settlements or judgments, and any deposits to pension funds. So very clear on items that you cannot use the ARPA funding for. So now I'm going to switch gears over to the school district world and what we like to call the ESSER funds, or the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Funds. There have been 3 phases of the ESSER funds, and you can see them listed there: ESSER 1, 2, and then what we're calling the American Rescue Plan, ARP ESSER funds. The first ESSER funds came out in May of 2020, shortly after the COVID pandemic essentially hit us in March of 2020. The second round came out in January 2021 of this year. And then there was a third round, which came under this American Rescue Plan funding in March of 2021. All 3 of those are subject to single audit requirement. All 3 of those have a time period of expenses that can be applied starting with March 13th, 2020, essentially the date of the pandemic. And then each one has a different ending date. The first phase goes through September 30th of 2022. The second phase, September 30th of 2023. And then the third phase, or that ARP phase, going through September 30th of 2024, kind of in line with the other ARPA fundings we're seeing out there. So what can the ESSER funds be used for? It's a pretty, and a lot of you on the call, you've been through the ESSER phase 1, at least at this point. So a lot of you are familiar with this, but it really is broad in essentially, several items that include preparedness and response efforts related to COVID, addressing unique needs of high-risk populations, technology, mental health support for staff and students. Again, a long list, there's 10 bullet points here. ESSER 2 then said, all of the items we could use for ESSER 1 plus 3 more, addressing learning loss, making school facility repairs, and air quality needs. Then we got to that third phase, that ARP ESSER. And at this point, they're saying at least 20% of that should be used to address learning loss. So minimum 20% to be used towards addressing learning loss. And then the remaining portion, so up to 80%, can be used for a broad array of programs and needs for school district operations. So there's a lot of funding out there, and there's been a lot of discussion as far as federal funding, COVID impacts, et cetera. I just kind of, barely scratched the surface with those two funds, but those are the big ones we're talking about right now. A couple other considerations related to COVID federal funding and your entities. Thinking about COVID impacts, if you've been through an audit already that was impacted by the pandemic, you probably had some of these conversations. But again, we're still being impacted. There are still changes. So making sure that any changes or updates to policies and procedures are happening. If there's anything that any boards need to be involved in and making, like approving any additional, signers or changing signers or any other changes to policies and procedures, making sure they are documented, even if they have to be documented as a retroactive action. Juggling funding sources. So there's a lot of funding sources out there. Make sure that in some capacity, you are tracking your funding received and its use, when it was used, and making sure that you have that documentation for all of those uses. Make sure that you're not double dipping. So there are many different funding sources that cover some of the same things. So we want to make sure that we are not double dipping in our funding. And essentially, you've got it scheduled out as far as what's going to what funding source. And as an auditor, document. We can never stress this enough. This is, again, going to help you not only if there's an audit, if something is questioned during an audit, if something is questioned in, say, you're submitting a report and someone comes back and asks where that information came from, that is really going to help you remember what the thought process there and the rationale, especially if there are judgments that need to be made based on any of the guidance. CIFA reporting, for those of you out there that do report a CIFA, make sure that you review all of your new revenue sources for compliance requirements and applicability for single audit requirements or any other type of audit requirements. Make sure that COVID-related funds are separately identified on your CIFA. And those of you that have passed through funds to subrecipients are familiar with making sure that it's documented, making sure that you're following any monitoring requirements. But for some of you that might be new, where you might have gotten federal funds in and you're passing them on to other entities or organizations. So those need to be disclosed as pass-through funds. Make sure you're making your subrecipient aware that they are federal funds and therefore have compliance requirements related to them. And then make sure that you're monitoring that those funds are being used correctly, because you ultimately are responsible for those funds. Couple other items as far as what's going on in the federal funding world: single audit due date extension. So it's been a crazy year plus now where we've had due dates going all over the place and moving forward in multiple jumps. At this point, I did list the OMB, or Office of Management and Budget memorandum, on here, but that does include a 6-month single audit submission extension for all single audits of fiscal years through June 30, 2021 that have not yet been submitted. So again, there was some changes there where for certain audits, it was being pushed forward. Now it's all audits through fiscal year June 30, 2021 that have not yet been submitted. There is an automatic 6-month extension. Always a big topic in the single audit world is the compliance supplement and when we will get to see that. And of course, as I'm sitting here, we have not seen that. We are not sure when it's going to be released. I think they said maybe August, but that just continues to probably be pushed back. Just a reminder, the 2020 supplement was released the first week of August last year, but then there was an addendum that got released in, it was an early Christmas present, December 22nd of 2020. We got that supplement that was released. We are under the impression and understanding that it'll be the same situation this year, where there will be a compliance supplement and then most likely an addendum that comes out. There are already discussions among some of our clients and our audit teams as we're preparing that. What if we don't get the compliance supplement in time to get our audits out, based on when we normally would on our normal timeline or audit schedule? And there is an option to issue the financial statements without the single audit. And then once the proper information is obtained or received, then to go back and do the single audit. Not saying that's going to be what happens, but just to put that out there, that there is that option. obviously, as time goes along here and audits start moving, we'll be watching that carefully and talking about what are options there. And one resource that I did want to point out on the Government Audit Quality Center, or as we like to call the GAQC Center, GAQC website, there is a good summary. Now, I will say the summary is as of February 16th, 2021. So not updated recently. I expect it will probably be updated in the near future. I can't define near future, though, with some decisions with the ARPA funding and also as the new compliance supplement comes out. So hopefully we'll be seeing an updated copy of this on the GAQC website. But essentially, this is a nice schedule that talks about all of the COVID funds, their applicability to single audit or uniform guidance, and other kind of rules or items that go along with those funding sources. So definitely something that I recommend checking out. Again, I talked about 2 of the funding sources here this morning, but there is a whole list of funding sources that potentially were open to your organization depending on your entity. Okay, so we are now going to move on to, for those of you who might be new to federal funding, and this is, I just talked about some of the hot topics and we talked about some funding sources, and there are many entities out there that might be completely new to federal funding or in the past have maybe received something that was pretty de minimis as far as dollar amounts and really have not had to worry about compliance requirements, what the federal sources really mean, et cetera. So just a high level overview of really what it means to look at federal funds, reporting requirements, compliance requirements, audit requirements, et cetera. So all federal funds have what we call a CFDA number, or a Catalog of Federal Domestic Assistance number. And I did list the website there where you can look these up. It's beta.sam.gov, where you can look up any program, any CFDA number, et cetera. And what that's going to give you is all of the information about that program. So first off, every program is going to have a 5-digit number. So the first 2 digits, and I have an example here of 21.027. So the first 2 digits refer to the federal department. So 21 in this case is the Department of Treasury. The last 3 digits then refer to the program. So 027 is the coronavirus state and local fiscal funds. So that tells you if you get a grant document, an award letter, et cetera, that has this 5-digit number and it's got the 2 digits, the period, and the 3 digits, and you don't have any other information, you can go to this website and look up that funding source, and it's going to tell you pretty much everything you need to know about that program, the overview, et cetera. There are some programs that we call clusters, and these are federal programs that are really related to each other. And what is unique about these clusters of programs is they are going to be reported together and also tested together if they have to be tested. So, you might not have any of these clusters, but just so you're aware that you might see these as far as clusters of programs. A couple examples are Research and Development Cluster. There's a Student Financial Assistance Cluster, and also the National School Lunch Program, which most school districts out there are going to be familiar with. And again, they're treated as one program for single audit purposes in calculating and testing. So I did refer to the CFA a little bit earlier. The CFA is the Schedule of Federal Awards, and this is really what an entity is going to use to include in their financial statements to really show all of the federal funds that were received. And it's going to list all of the funds by federal agency and program. So again, that CFDA number is going to be included on there. Pass-through entity name and identifying award number. So for example, if the Department of Education passes through funds to the Pennsylvania Department of Education, who then passes through funds to School District XYZ, that School District XYZ on their CFA will have not only the Department of Education listed, but also the Pennsylvania Department of Education listed as the pass-through of those funds. And then usually that pass-through person has an award number. That's how they keep track of their awards. And so all that information needs to be included on the CFA. Also on there are the program amounts, the time periods that are covered by that grant, the amount that was expended, and any other information related to clusters, if applicable. And then if you yourself as an entity have subrecipients where you're receiving funds and passing it on to a subrecipient, you must include that information on your CFA as well. It really is that kind of table, kind of like, I want to say table of contents, or really that guide to show, okay, here's where the funds came and here's where they went. We want to track them through the whole way of their life cycle. So as far as guidance and where to go for resources, there's two main areas that you'll want to go to. Uniform guidance is the federal overarching guidelines, requirements, overview, et cetera, of federal funds. And so we call this, you'll see it's 2 CFR 200. CFR is the Code of Federal Regulations. And so this is really where the beginning point of federal funds and how they can be used, et cetera. And it's broken down into subparts A through F. And I did include the link on how to get to the Code of Federal Regulation there. But essentially, that's going to be able to tell you all of the nitty-gritty details as far as what needs to be done with federal funds. The next piece of that then is the Office of Management and Budget OMB Compliance Supplement. And this is the supplement that I was speaking to that comes out every year. We're patiently or impatiently waiting for it, as always. But this is where you're really going to dig a little bit deeper into the requirements of your federal funds, how to prepare for an audit, what an auditor is looking at. So this is one thing, kind of a side note, I feel like with audits, you never know what the auditor is going to look at. With a single audit, you know what the auditor is going to look at because the audit requirements are right there along with all of the program details. So there are different compliance requirements where it has suggested audit procedures and it has the nitty-gritty details as far as what that program should be used for. And this is where we're going to see requirements as like an umbrella but of all federal programs, but then there's also going to be the individual requirements per program. And so what's nice is if you're working with, program 21.027, you're going to be able to go to that agency and that program in the OMB compliance supplement and look at the requirements for that program. So again, it's no surprise what we as auditors are looking at. And really, as a recipient of those funds, you are the ones that are required or responsible for following all of the requirements related to that funding source. So I talked about compliance requirements. So this is where essentially it's what you can and cannot use funds for and how you can handle them and what you need to report back. And so essentially examples of those requirements, compliance requirements, are activities allowed and allowable costs, how you're actually using the funds. Cash management, is it a reimbursement grant? Are you paying for things first and then submitting to be reimbursed, or are you just getting all of the grant funds at once? Are you getting monthly payments, et cetera? And then how are you handling that cash when it is received? Eligibility, some grants have specific eligibility requirements. Period of performance, this is the time period when those funds can be used. So not only the time period when you're physically using those funds, but also the related expenses that can be applied to that funding source. And then reporting is the other big one. There are more compliance requirements, but these are really just the major ones that essentially we're often talking about. But reporting then is how you're reporting, whether it's submitting a budget beforehand, before getting the funds, whether it's quarterly reports, annual reports, a final report, there are going to be different reporting requirements, and there could be reporting requirements to multiple agencies depending on if you're a pass-through, the funding source, et cetera. So in addition to compliance requirements, there are then also internal controls. And so you are required to establish and maintain internal controls as an organization specifically related to that federal funding. But it's always essentially good to be having those internal controls as an entity-wide, but essentially you are required to have internal controls related to those compliance areas. And policies and procedures related to both the compliance requirements and the related internal controls must be documented in line with requirements and followed. And those are all going to be items that we look for when we're doing our audit. But essentially those, again, are the responsibility of the entity receiving the funds because you are, essentially being entrusted with those funds and they must be used properly. So what is a single audit? A single audit, the purpose of it is to determine whether or not an entity has complied with direct and material compliance requirements of its federal awards. So there are kind of three layers to this audit when we're doing a single audit. So I'll say a normal financial statement audit falls in line with generally accepted auditing standards under the AICPA. That's our basic normal financial audit. Then we add our second layer, and we call that Yellow Book, or generally accepted government auditing standards. We like our acronyms. That's going to add an additional layer to your audit where we're looking at compliance and we're looking at internal control related to funding sources, but it's additional reporting, understanding, different additional guidelines. Then we get to that third layer where it's that true single audit layer where we're testing compliance and we're testing internal controls related to funding sources. There are many examples of auditees out there that only have to have those first two layers. They have not hit the single audit threshold. So it's really important when you're receiving grant funding or any funding from a government source, particularly, that you're looking at the requirements of that grant. Is it required to have are you required to have an audit each year if you don't already? Are you required to have this audit under Yellow Book, or does it fall under a full single audit? And we are required to test in relation to uniform guidance, test compliance and the related controls. So every single audit, we've got to test compliance on the programs that have to be selected. And then the related internal controls to those compliance requirements must be tested. Single audits must be performed annually. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, we're going to say they must be tested annually. And then there's this whole reporting package that gets submitted to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse, which includes what's called a data collection form. And that form summarizes essentially all the federal activity, gets submitted to the federal government, as well as attaches the actual financial report package with the audit opinion. It all gets uploaded online. And that's how the federal agencies that were the originators of those funds are going to get their reporting as far as where those funds went, in addition to any other reports that would be required. So like I said, not everyone needs a single audit. So a single audit is required when a non-federal entity expends $750,000 or more federal awards in a fiscal year. This is calculated in total from all sources. So you may have received federal funds from two different sources, and neither one of those sources were more than 750, but in combination, in total, they were more than 750,000 in that fiscal year. You need a single audit. It includes direct and indirect funding, and it's calculated based on when the funds are expended, not received. So it's really easy as far as dollars to think about things being expended and it's going to be based on your basis of accounting. But essentially, there are other things, and I did include a chart down at the bottom here. I'm not going to go through everything, but for example, if your organization receives food commodities, you're going to include it on your CFA, or you're going to include it in your calculation of the 750,000 when those food commodities are distributed or consumed. If there's donated property, it's when the property is received. So it's not just writing a check. There are other things that go into essentially what's considered expending funds. For the most part, it's really going to be the normal writing the check or paying the bill as we think about. But again, 750,000 or more in the fiscal year expended. So one item that I did want to kind of spend a few minutes on is procurement. And procurement, I will give you the basic definition, is really the spending of funds and who you're using to spend those federal funds and how you're determining that. I'll say that's Krista's definition of procurement. And this has become a little bit it's always a hot topic, I will say, but it has become even more surfaced recently because, we've got a lot of issues as far as finding resources that we need in all industries. There's a lot of funding that's coming down through. There's a lot of funding that's being spent. There's a lot of changes to our industries. So our normal kind of course of business in what projects we're doing or what we're purchasing has been impacted in some way. So there are procurement standards in the Code of Federal Regulations that essentially must be followed by all non-federal entities. Your procurement procedures must be documented. You may not have conflicts of interest in who you're working with as your vendors, and you must consider the most economical purchase option as much as possible, I'll say. There are always going to be some asterisks or caveats to that, but essentially that's the point, is we want to make the federal funds go as far as possible. And I say we, the federal government is wanting that. An entity, what's interesting is an entity can actually have a stricter procurement policy than the federal government, but you cannot have a less strict policy than the federal government. What's interesting here is, again, your procurement policy must be documented. If your entity has a more strict policy than the federal government and is documented as it should be, and that's the policy you're following, that's the policy that you will be audited against, because that is your documented policy. However, if your entity has a procurement policy that is less strict, the federal guidelines are what would be audited, because that really is the true minimum that the entity should be following. And what I mean by these policies is how you're purchasing or determining how you're going to be buying things. And there's really 5 methods of procurement. So we have these, and I will say, all of these thresholds, there can be thresholds that are dependent by federal agency. So there's kind of an overarching umbrella of this is the common threshold or level, but you do really want to make sure that you're taking a look at each of your funding sources and the related funding agency to make sure that there, again, isn't more strict policies that need to be followed for that funding source. Essentially, micro purchases, these are going to be small purchases up to $10,000. They must be documented and allowable, but essentially you can buy them as is. The next step up is what we call small purchases. So typically between $10,000 and $250,000. Again, your policy should be documented. It's dependent on the funding agency, but this is where we need to make sure that we're checking out prices or rates, obtaining quotes to make sure that we're not just going to the store down the street because it's the easiest, making sure that, again, we're finding the most economic option for what we need. The third level then is sealed bids. So this is essentially a request for proposal process where all of the bids are going to be opened at one time in a public setting. And this really creates that level playing field. The fourth one is similar. It's competitive proposals. And really they don't have to act specifically like the sealed bids in the fact that you're opening them all at once in the public, but you do, since you're essentially not doing it all at once in public, you have to have a technical analysis performed and then make that technical analysis public. So you don't necessarily have to have all these envelopes in the same room in a public meeting, open them. You can do it before a public meeting, but you have to have a specific analysis of how you are going to compare the proposals, and that analysis has to be made public. So then the fifth way of purchasing things is sole source. And this is the one that has really come to forefront with all of the changes in industries and supplies and demand and all of our needs. And this is where it's non-competitive. You're not really, I don't want to say you're not following the above items, but essentially there is a situation or a reason where you cannot follow the top, the above 4 items, the other 4 options. And so essentially it's non-competitive and it must meet one or more of the following. It's only available from one source. The purchase cannot be delayed. It's urgent. It's an emergency. And this is one where we've really seen a lot recently. There's a written request submitted and approved by your federal agency, and then competitive bidding is deemed to be inadequate. So 4 bullet points here that, again, take some interpretation. And I just actually went through this with one of my clients. And at the end of the day, we called our solicitor, and our solicitor essentially was a part of the conversation because it was an emergency repair that needed to be made. And we talked through it. And in this case, there was actually a project that needed to be done, but a piece of that was an emergency. And so it was documented that the one piece that was the emergency, we could go through, and the rest of the project had to go through the normal bidding process. So again, make sure that you are documenting your interpretation there and including your solicitor as needed to make sure that we're following all requirements as governmental entities. So I wanted to deep dive a little bit there into procurement. A couple quick resources: make sure you're looking at your grant documents, your federal and state agency websites. I gave you the uniform guidance, the OMB compliance supplement, the Government Audit Quality Center, and SAM.gov. That's where, again, related to procurement, they actually have vendors that you are not allowed to use. They have been barred or suspended from obtaining federal funding. So we don't run into this a lot, but make sure that you are taking a look to see that the vendors you're using are allowed with federal funds. So I know I threw a lot at you there in 30 minutes, and I think my time is up. But if you do have any questions related to any of those topics, please make sure you send those in, and I'll try to get to them at the roundtable tomorrow. And thank you very much. Have a great day, everyone.